everybody to our Undivided Live. Happy Thursday. So we're here to talk about how standards-based goals and curriculum can work for any child. We'll be tackling the most common myths and best practices in addition to your questions from the chat window. I'm Lindsay Crane, the head of content and community at Undivided. I'm here with Dr. Caitlin Solone, a teacher educator and faculty within UCLA's Disabilities Studies Department. Hi, Katie.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Happy Thursday.
Yes, and welcome back. We are always happy to have you here. So let's get right to it. Let's talk goals. So first, just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, Dr. Solone, can you define standards-based goals? When we say that, what does it mean?
When we're talking about standards-based goals, we're talking about IEP goals that directly align with the standards that are aligned with the grade level that your child is in. So if your child is in second grade, then we're talking about IEP goals that align with second grade standards for whichever state that you're tuning in from.
And just so we can clarify, those state standards still apply to students with IEPs.
Always,
correct?
always, always, and they always should. Just because a child has an IEP, just because a child's on alternate curriculum does not mean that they should not have a standards-based IEP. All IEP goals should be aligned with the state standards. Yes.
Definitely. And I know both of us have talked to many parents who love the idea of standards-based goals, but they don't fully understand how they can make it work for their kids, and their IEP teams definitely don't know. They're not seeing this modeled in their schools. So let's just break it down. First, how can a child receive standards-based goals if they're not learning at grade level?
It does not matter where a child's at in order for them to have a standards-based IEP goal. Standards-based IEP goals, it doesn't mean that we're talking about IEP goals that are the same as the state standards. We're not talking about the same goals as the standards necessarily. What we're talking about is goals that are aligned, that they connect to, that we're working towards those standards. So you can think about it like benchmarks leading up to the Common Core or the state standards that are being utilized. And so I like to think about it as a roadmap going to the overarching standard. And so your goals should be somewhere along that roadmap, getting you to that ultimate destination.
So can you maybe give us an example? Because I know one thing that's hard, what we hear from, which I'm sure you've heard from many parents as well, like how do you write a standards-based goal, for example, a fifth grader who is, a reading goal for a fifth grader who is maybe reading on a kindergarten level? So how does a parent even start thinking to approach that?
That's a really great question. And I want to point out two things here. One is that, when we're thinking about these goals, we're thinking about, say, fifth grade reading standards. Well, in fifth grade, we're not working on phonics anymore. We're working really on more deeper concepts around reading and comprehension. And so when we're talking about students who are not quite there at fifth grade level, what do you mean, right? Are we talking about their comprehension level, their phonetic skills, their, oral reading fluency? What are we talking about here? And so it's important to break that piece down because there are many components of reading, right? And so when we're looking at goals that are aligned to the state standards and we're looking at a fifth grade standard in reading, say we're taking reading comprehension, for example, and we want to make sure that your child is working towards a goal that is going to be aligned with a fifth grade reading comprehension goal. Well, we can break that down and say, okay, so maybe we're not working towards reading the text and comprehending it, but maybe we're working towards listening to that higher level text and comprehending it, right? And so it's really thinking critically about how are we breaking down these goals. Now, if a child doesn't have their phonics skills yet, then I would always recommend still have those reading goals that are aligned to the core fundamental goals of reading. You still want to make sure your child's getting really meaningful reading instruction. But when we're talking about goals that are aligned with the standards, say in fifth grade, then we got to break it down and talk about what type of goal and what is the most essential component here. Just because a child's not reading at fifth grade level doesn't mean actually that they can't comprehend at a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh grade level, right? It just simply means that they're not reading it in a standard way that we're typically used to.
And another part of the, which I was sort of the big aha moment for me, if you're looking at the standards and it still feels like I don't know how to connect what my child is doing if they're not at grade level, that the Common Core connectors, I think, are something that exists that a lot of parents and schools, but I'll ask about that in a minute, but that they don't know exist, that are, I will say on a personal level, every time I start an IEP, I will get out and thinking about my goals, I will look at, or my daughter's goals, I will look at, the grade level standard. I usually look at maybe the year before, and then I look at the Common Core connectors and is it the essential understandings. So I can really see, like, that really helps. Great. Like, here's all of these words. It sometimes feels like a foreign language. I'm not a teacher, but then here is what they are talking about. This is what they're trying to master. This is what all students are going to be working on that year. So how do we draw up something that makes sense for my daughter? But those core connectors are really sort of the heart and the root of how I approach all of our IEP goals. But if you can talk to parents, tell parents what that is and how they can use those.
The Common Core connectors and the essential understandings are crucial in helping to develop these standards-based IEP goals. And if your school is not using it yet, show them. I'm sure we'll be sharing resources with you, links to exactly what we're referring to, but share those with your teachers, your IEP team, because many schools, many teachers don't have access to these resources that are really super valuable and meaningful in terms of developing these standards-based IEP goals. They will thank you, I am sure. They will be like, thank you for this great resource, because it really breaks it down. And it's something that I always wished as a teacher that I had, and I couldn't find it. And so it is wonderful that we are starting to see these resources start to be fleshed out more and more. But when we are using the Common Core connectors and essential understandings, you can think about it like, here's the overarching 5th grade reading comprehension goal. And the Common Core connector is what a child needs to be able to do in order to then reach that goal. And so can your child reach this overarching goal? Maybe not quite yet, but can they work towards meeting this goal in the Common Core connector? Can they work towards this benchmark that they'll need to be able to do to then reach that further goal? If we're not here yet, then we look at the essential understanding. What is the essential thing that the child needs to understand in order to master that Common Core connector so that they can then get to that common or that state standard? And so you look at that essential understanding. Can my child reach that goal? Is that a meaningful goal for my child? And if the answer is yes, then you found the goal that you're working on. Sometimes those essential understandings might be too advanced. Sometimes that's the reality once we get into the upper grades. They might be. But then you can break it down even further by looking at grade levels prior and seeing the linked standards, because they link from year to year. And so you think about kindergarten, we're working in kindergarten, building up to 1st grade, building up to 2nd grade, building up to 3rd grade, and so forth. And so if the 5th grade essential understanding is still too much, then we're going to look back at 4th grade standard connector essential understanding that relates to that same standard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And well, I have many questions, but also as you were saying that, I thought the traditional IEP goal that probably a lot of people here can relate to is also a cumulative sort of goal but it looks a little different. It's okay, so you're going to get 15 more sight words. Your child will get 15 more sight words than the year before, or they're going to count 25 objects instead of 20 on one-to-one correspondence. So that's, I think, a very traditional kind of goal that is still seen as cumulative. So what should parents do if these are the goals that are being thrown out at IEPs? Do they bring a copy of the Common Core standards and their own ideas? Like how involved should parents be? Obviously, I will say the ideal is to try to talk to your teams before an IEP so they know exactly what you're expecting and they can have time to think about how to make that work. But so many schools push this and a lot of teachers have been using this for years. So are these worthwhile, and how should they react?
Well, they are golden. And I would say what first came to mind was help the IEP team. If you have these resources that are going to help them develop more meaningful goals, not only for your child, but for the other students that they serve, then by all means support, help them. And of course, the tact and the way that you go about it is really important, because you are an IEP team, and it might not always feel like that from the parent end, and it might not always feel like that from the teacher, admin, service provider end, but you're all a team. And if the more you can prioritize that and show camaraderie and collaboration, the more your team grows and becomes stronger and is more capable of supporting your child holistically. So I would say give it to them. If you have these resources and you're pretty confident they don't have it, share it with them. And, now that being said, it's not the expectation that you have a goal for every single standard at a grade level. That would be impossible to measure. And so what you really want to do is this is really where the collaboration comes in. You want to work with your teachers and your IEP team and take a look at those standards, the Common Core connectors, essential understandings, and take a step back and say, what are the most meaningful standards that we want to work towards? What is actually going to help my child thrive in life and help them obtain the skills that they need to be a successful, happy, engaged member of the community and society? And so it's really important to note that, because it can feel overwhelming when you see this long list of standards. But give that resource to your IEP team, ask that all of your goals are aligned to it, and work collaboratively with your IEP team to discern which goals are going to be the most relevant and meaningful, and the goals that can be worked on the most in class for the duration of the year, right? You don't want to just pick one standard that's going to be taught for a very small portion of the year, right? You want to think about what are the things that are going to carry over across this entire school year.
Right. And how do you bring all of your classes into those? Like if there's, grades, there's vocabulary, there's all kinds of words. So great. Does your child need to, to be pre-taught some science vocabulary words? Great. You build those goals in, and they're still getting what they need, and they're functional in the best way, functional IEP goals. And I actually had a question about that as well, because we had some questions ahead of time. Is there a place for functional academic goals, and can they be standards based?
Yes, and yes. Yes and yes. When you think about functional academic goals, you're thinking about like what is actually going to be meaningful in my child's life, right? What is going to give them the skills, the self-help skills, the daily living skills that they need to thrive. But many of the standards have components of them that are just that. So you might not have a cooking goal, but you might have like a following directions goal, following multi-step directions, reading the instructions, being able to follow a checklist and things like that. So you're thinking about what are the skills that are going to build towards these goals. And yes, they can be aligned with the standards. And the standards are not just reading, writing, math. And the standards include things like listening and speaking and different things like that as well. So you're really getting kind of this holistic view of what kids are expected to learn throughout their academic career. And through that lens, you're able to then extract some really meaningful functional skills and goals through the use of those standards.
I think that's a great point, because we did have some questions too about, there were some people saying that my child has really executive functioning goals on his IEP. So can those still be aligned with standards? I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to hear an example of something, because when you were talking, I immediately thought even like behavioral goals, like if there's listening, or there, like you said, the state standards, if your child still needs support for them to behaviorally be able to attain those goals, then that is a way to align those standards with also the behavioral goals. So it's all functional. But I would love for you to give some examples,
right,
just to bring that to life.
So say you want your child to work on executive function skills. Maybe you want them to work on utilizing a checklist or to-do list, right? A checklist. And that's a really functional thing. I use checklists all the time. I wouldn't be able to live without them. They help me manage my day and every task that I do. When we go to the grocery store, we use them. When we are cooking in the kitchen, we use them. When we are have a list of errands to run, we use checklists, right? Or however we manage it on our own. But you can use those in the context of a classroom and in the context of standards-based IEP goals, because you can talk about using a check, or you can have goals around using checklists across multiple subject areas to complete tasks, right? You can use a checklist during math to complete word problems, multi-step word problems, or even just one-step word problems. You can use checklists when you're going out to play to check, do I know who I'm going to play with today? Do I know what I'm going to play? Do I know who I can go turn to help on the playground, right? So these are just some very simple goals or examples that can show you that you can start to just think a little more broadly and creatively about embedding these goals throughout the different standards that are addressed in each academic year.
And another big concern from parents is that the gen ed curriculum or the standards that they will move too fast, right? Mm-hmm. Which can be a very legitimate concern, because if it's not done right and things are moving too fast, it's like, I've probably said this before, but I know even internally for me, it's like, do I want my child to be the guinea pig here, right? Like, if they don't have it together, is this going to be a total waste? And then districts will frequently say, well, your child can't learn in this environment the same way they can in a special ed classroom. So what is your response to the everything's moving too fast conversation? Even though we know for parents that can be a very legitimate concern, but what about when districts say, this isn't the right placement, things will move too fast? What would you like to say about that very common IEP conversation?
Such a common IEP conversation, and such a common justification as to why gen ed may not be the appropriate placement. And my response to that is that, yeah, the curriculum might be moving quickly, and we might be seeing teachers, because they have to cover so many standards, right? So gen ed classrooms, they do move fast, but that doesn't mean that every child, no matter how significant their support needs, can be engaging meaningfully in the curriculum despite the movement and momentum. Because you can have goals that really address their own unique needs, that allow them to engage in lessons and be a part of the class and engage in the learning, but through the lens of their unique goals that they're working on their own, right? Or not on their own, but as a member of that classroom. So for example, if they're in a math class in middle school and it's like, wow, these concepts are flying by and we're going through them super quickly. Yes, that is true, but we can still be working on checklists. We can still be working on really functional math skills through the context of different types of lessons, whether it's fractions, whether it's multiplying multi-digit numbers, whether it's positive and negative integers. All of these different types of concepts can be used to build students' strengths and capacity to master the foundational mathematical concepts and even, executive function behavioral goals as well.
Well, and I think my first response to that is what a lot of people's, it's like, that sounds great.
In theory.
Then how do we realistically make this work if there's no one identified to help modify any of the work in school? Like, what should parents ask for? Where it's like, yeah, I want to do this, and then here's this gen ed teacher who has all of these different students, who doesn't have time written into their, to their day. How can parents realistically say, this is what I want and these are the supports I need?
The biggest thing in making that type of system work is pre-planning and having that dedicated time for planning for teachers and as an IEP team, and thinking big picture and unit planning. So you don't have to necessarily be a part of the planning for every single tiny little lesson. You don't even have to modify every single worksheet for every single tiny little lesson, because truly that's not feasible all the time, right? But we can think about what are the systems that we can put in place. How can we plan for this 6-week unit through the context of my child's IEP goals and set them up to thrive during this unit and get a lot out of it. And it does require that pre-planning, but when you do take that step back and take a look kind of more broadly at the big picture, what is the goal of math this year for my child? What do I want them to get out of this time? And how can that be meaningful for them? And how can they be active members of the classroom community during this time? And you can come up with really thoughtful, meaningful systems that don't require a ton of overhead, and not overhead, but management and work. It takes that pre-planning for sure, and you have to have a committed team. But once you start to do it, you'll see it is a lot easier than it seems like at first. And I made the mistake when I first started teaching in an inclusive setting. I thought I had to modify every single paper, like worksheet. I had to modify every single moment of every single day. And I was at work until like midnight every night, and still wasn't getting everything done. And it wasn't until later that I realized, wow, I've been going about this all wrong. And really the way to do it is to do this unit planning and really look kind of broadly at the big picture and the big ideas, the big goals that we are working towards, and then how can the lessons fit into those, rather than how can each tiny lesson fit into the goal. So kind of thinking about it in the inverse and backwards planning.
Right, I was just going to say work backwards. And of course, the gold standard would be that these lessons and curriculums were devised, sort of like what Pam is saying in the chat, but devised for all learners. Yeah, Pam said these suggestions of yours help educators think of ways to use these techniques for all learners and the unique skill sets. That, of course, would be the gold standard, but unfortunately, it's not even the norm.
It's so funny too that you mentioned that, because I was recently in a school and looking at the curriculum and then looking at the standards and realizing that oftentimes teachers are trying to jam through so much because the curriculum that they have decided to use as a school takes you through so quickly. But when you look at the standards that are required of teachers, it's not, it is more simplified than what many teachers feel like they have to do, and also what the curriculum implies that they should be doing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so they're balancing the state standards, their own like school or district's curriculum, and then also figuring out how to make all of these things work for all learners, and in most cases without support, without training, and without resources.
Right.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, all of those things make it really challenging for teachers, and I'm seeing a lot of growth and improvement there too. And I'm seeing a lot of teachers start to really pick up these universal design for learning strategies where they're really employing those in the classroom. And once universal design for learning is considered, and what that is, it's giving options for the ways students learn material, different modalities for learning the material and choice, different modalities for showing what they know and demonstrating their understanding. So not just one multiple choice test at the end of a unit to show that you know and understand this concept, but many different ways to demonstrate their understanding and many different ways to engage in the learning. And so when teachers really set the stage and start thinking about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, as the priority, then it makes adapting the curriculum for our learners that need more supports in place so much easier.
How do parents, so they go to their IEP, and I know it's sort of an advocacy question too, which we can ask when we're talking to Dr. Palenka as well, the educational advocate that we're speaking to next week. But schools might be like, we already do differentiated learning, Or how can a parent go and advocate for that kind of professional training for their team, for UDL, to really start getting people understanding what that means, what that can look like, how they can work together, working backwards? Like how can you bring that into your IEP when they're looking at you like, we have no idea how to make this happen?
Mm-hmm. And it's a careful process, right? I mean, and there's so many factors involved in what professional developments teachers get. I mean, I can tell you a lot of teachers want this UDL training too. And then a lot of teachers feel really overwhelmed by it because it feels like this huge big thing that they're unsure how to navigate and unsure what it is. Many teachers are already doing it and don't even realize it, right? And so, in your IEPs, I would just continuously bring up that language around UDL. And what I've seen is the more parents who are talking about a certain concept or a certain topic, the more that starts to really sink in and start to demonstrate that that's a priority to parents, and it starts to become a priority to teachers and to admin in terms of training too. And so same goes for inclusion. The more parents that start to talk about inclusion at a school, the more that starts to become the gradual and growing ethos of the school, right? And then the priority of the school. But if nobody's talking about it, nobody's throwing out those key words, then it oftentimes gets overlooked unless it's a very significant priority for the teachers right off the bat or the admin, which oftentimes they're juggling so many different things, and it's always something new. So these things aren't going away though. Inclusion, standards-based IEP goals, that's in the law. The law says that is a requirement of the IEP goals, and then and UDL.
And I mean, and you hit on obviously we have to do what we can within that IEP to get our child needs and, legally deserves. And then there's a whole other aspect of systemic change where all of the parents, and because when you really break it down to where is it based in law or ethics or research to show that standards-based goals don't apply to students with disabilities, and
oh yeah,
I know we keep going to a rabbit hole about that, but it really, just falls back on a history of segregation and antiquated ideals that are not based in.
And there are many reasons why students with IEPs in general education settings do fare so much better than students who are in self-contained settings. There are many reasons why that's the case, but one of them is this the curriculum that's presented to them and the ideas and the learning that they're exposed to in that setting. But that's not to say that can't take place in special day classrooms. It's just to say that there's not a structure for it currently. So what tends to happen is what you were talking about earlier, where it's like these added vocabulary words, added sight words, added number identification, and we're just building off of these really minuscule concepts that aren't actually teaching students the skills that they need to know to thrive in the world and in their own bodies and minds, right? And so when we're thinking about why is it that inclusion is so successful, and why is it that students have access to general education curriculum at such far greater rates in these settings? It's because the systems aren't in place in other settings to do so all the time. It's not to say all the time that's the case, right? Of course, it happens in many cases, I'm sure, but
it's easier in the special ed classrooms. I will speak from our experience. It's a lot of intervention versus any curriculum.
And the grade level spans so widely, right? So if you're teaching a 3rd through 5th grade class, then you have to look at all the standards and all the students' IEP goals. It's overwhelming. It's just a lot, and there's no structure really for that is meaningful. There are some alternate curriculum programs that are aligned with the state standards, but again, they tend to be a little more cursory.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue to the multi-level classroom. We received this question ahead of time, and I just want to read it outright because I feel like probably represents a lot of parents, you know, in their children's experiences. But she wrote that my child's in a special ed classroom. The special setting has never used gen ed curriculum, books, or any recognizable standards. It's basically a multi-grade warehouse. She's now fallen several levels behind, grade levels behind, which has become the new excuse not to allow her in a mainstream classroom. I obviously can't include goals for every standard on her IEP. What can I do to make sure she makes meaningful progress? And it's kind of encapsulates everything we've been talking about. But my first response was just like low standards, low standards, low standards. But
Yeah.
you know what else would you like to add on to this parent? Just because I feel like, again, this is very sadly common.
It is, and I'm so sorry to hear that that's this parent's experience. It really is a bummer to hear the situations like this. And unfortunately, you're not alone in that. Unfortunately and fortunately, but mostly unfortunately, you're not alone in that, because that is the common practice. And I would just encourage you to continue expecting standards-based IEP goals for whatever your child's grade would be if they were in gen ed, their chronological grade that's associated with their age. Just continue to expect and support your IEP team in ensuring that all of your child's IEP goals do align with the standards. And oftentimes it's parent advocacy that then trickles down and impacts way more students, because through one parent's advocacy and efforts in fighting for this, then a teacher starts to realize, oh, this is actually really good. This is meaningful. This is important. And this is a really powerful way to go about developing IEP goals. And once those IEP goals are developed and in place, then it is the responsibility of the IEP team and teachers to develop curriculum that's going to allow for a student to reach those goals. Now that gets complicated, and there's all sorts of questions there around, does that really happen, and how do you ensure that that happens? And you know, that's complicated in and of itself. And I would also build that strong allyship with your teacher and ask if there's support that the teacher needs, and maybe any advocacy that you can do on behalf of the teacher with the administration, either on your school site or at the district level. Because it's through efforts like that then we start to see the districts and administration start to make these things more of a priority.
Yeah, any systemic changes, yeah, as everyone I am sure on this call or that is listening to this knows, requires a Herculean amount of effort from parents and all stakeholders.
Right.
I also, you've mentioned alternate curriculum a couple of times, and you know, a lot of families, as you know, that sort of comes up for the first time when their children are entering even third grade, because that's when the standards, like the testing starts. So and a lot of parents, what does this mean? So should parents refuse? And if they don't, how do we navigate an alternate curriculum and still have a standards-based education?
That's a really great question. And I would say it's definitely case by case, but if your child is in one of the younger grades, and especially, you know, kindergarten, first, second, third, even fourth in many cases, then if it were me and my child, I would not agree to an alternate curriculum until maybe fourth grade, maybe fifth grade, because I think it really does lower the expectations for students when they are on alternate curriculum. Alternate curriculum is tied to the state testing. And so if a child's on alternate curriculum, so that's a consideration too. So maybe third grade, so third grade is when state testing starts in California. And so once state testing starts, the school has to determine, is the child going to take the alternate assessment or the typical state assessment? And so that's oftentimes when these conversations are had around alternate curriculum. And if a student's not on alternate curriculum, then they are expected to take the typical state test. And so that presents some challenges, of course, especially when the test isn't always accommodated properly, and it might be truly too advanced. And so thinking about, you know, is that a good time then when testing starts to make that determination? Or would I rather keep my child on general education curriculum even once testing starts and opt out of testing? Opting out of testing is always your right. Schools are limited by the number of parents that or students that they're allowed to have opted out. So it's not something that looks good for schools when parents do this, but it is a parent's right. And if it's not going to be a meaningful experience, or if you're not going to obtain meaningful data through those tests, then it is an option. But yeah, I think when parents are encouraged, especially in kindergarten, first and second grade, to go on alt curriculum, I would definitely push against that and would not agree to that if it were me. And once the students get older, even if a child's on alternate curriculum, they should still have a standards-based education. They still should have IEP goals that are standards-based, and they should still be making meaningful progress on those IEP goals. Now, if a school is really adamant that if a child's on alt curriculum, they can't be in gen ed, then that changes things, and that, is not a legal practice, but it does change things in the way that you go about it as a parent in terms of what you are willing to agree to or not. If you're really comfortable with your IEP team, they're going to support your child. That going on alt curriculum feels right to you as a parent internally, like intuitively you feel like that is what is going to be best. It's not always a bad thing. And you can always go off of alt curriculum back on gen ed curriculum if that is what is necessary and what the IEP team deems as appropriate. And that gets complicated too, because then you might have conflicting opinions about that, and it might be difficult depending on your IEP team. But the key is to know your IEP team, know what they think, and make sure that your IEP team really knows and understands what it means to go on alt curriculum. You would think that you wouldn't have to ensure that your IEP team really knows what that means, but oftentimes you do, because usually these are institutional practices that are just in place and happen just because they always happen, or just because all kids that look like this go on alt curriculum, that's what I'm going to always do. And so you want to really make sure that your IEP team understands what that really means, what it means for you and your family and your child, what your goals are for your child in their future, what their goals are for themselves, and what the right path is from there.
Get those vision statements ready and say, this is what we need to do, in order to reach this goal for our child. But also, to be clear, I think a lot of people also hear, well, if your child can't reach, or if your child requires modifications on the state standards, then they should be pushed to the alt curriculum. But that seems like another huge myth, right? Like, if you choose alt curriculum, you can, but if your child needs every single thing modified and maybe even has pass fail or modified grades, they can still be on a standards-based curriculum that's appropriate for them. Is that correct?
They can still be on a standards-based curriculum that's appropriate for them. It would be called an alternate curriculum if that is the path, yes, but still would be standards-based for sure.
Because I know there's some districts too that have literally kind of an alt curriculum, right? As well, like some larger districts have, they're not looking at the standards, and it's like an out of the box curriculum that's what they're having students, follow along for their goals instead of looking at the state standards at all.
Yes, and well, kind of. So the bigger districts do have alt curriculum. Oftentimes it's one particular curriculum, and that particular curriculum is said to be standards-based and aligned with the state standards. But it gets really loose because they're aligned, but they're not as rich and meaningful and expansive. And there's one curriculum. So if you're teaching like 3rd through 5th grade, there's an upper level and there's a lower level. So there's a lot of repeating that happens then too. And the curriculum changes from year to year, but so it's certainly not ideal, but in some cases it can be a helpful tool to then use to expand on. But it does kind of, on one hand, it gives teachers something to use that is more meaningful than not having anything at all.
Mhm.
But in some cases, in many cases, it really limits, it puts like this glass ceiling on how much we're going to push students when they are on alternate curriculum.
Right. And I see Carrie is asking, is unique one of those?
Yeah, unique is exactly what I'm referring to.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And it's honestly, it's one of the only ones that is robust enough to cross over multiple subjects and grade levels. And so, yeah, we need some curriculum developers. We need the folks who are creating the curriculum for general education. We need those folks to really start to think about how to adapt the curriculum and make it more expansive and accessible for varied learners. I mean, that's a component of advocacy too, right? Like calling those publishing companies of those general education curriculum books or curriculums and asking them, where's the alternate curriculum that's aligned with the fifth grade blah blah blah, right? Because that's a huge missing link. And the more publishers and curriculum development that takes place and centralizes all students and prioritizes all students, and the more we can get curriculum that is expansive and can address many different learners' needs, the more we're going to see inclusive practices take place, because then teachers are going to have more of what they need to be able to really deliver that type of meaningful, differentiated instruction.
Right. Which goes back to Pam, your comment at the very beginning about like, let's look at this, as a whole and tackle this instead of always being reactive. Let's be proactive.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah.
And that is one of the, that is one of the pieces that I think that could stand to have a lot more advocacy around it. So we need to start calling.
We're going to have to figure that out, right? Like, yeah, I like this. Anybody have any ideas? Let's get this going. Let's start getting some inclusive curriculum from the get-go. I love this.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We also have a good question from Mitra for preschool. Can we have standards-based IEPs?
For preschool, actually, I would say yes, but I actually am not familiar with the preschool curriculum. I'm so sorry. I'm not familiar enough to speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, anybody, if you know, let us know in the chat window if anyone knows the answer. But Mitra, we can look into that.
Absolutely.
As well. Like, we definitely need to know, so we'll look into that. And
I know in preschool they have like their benchmarks, that the things that I've worked very briefly in a Head Start and know that they have certain goals that they're all working towards. And it's a lot easier in preschool to make sure that those goals are aligned with whatever the class is working on. So from that lens, then yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll look into that. Mitra, we'll let you know. It's a great question. There was another question, Dr. Solone, wouldn't it be better for gen ed curriculum providers to provide embedded modifications? Maybe.
Yes. That's precisely what we're talking about here. Please, let's get that going. I wish that was available, and that would be a huge game changer for the field.
It would be huge. Also, we had a question, which is the standard for a lot of us, right? You get that IEP draft. Hopefully you're getting that a couple days ahead of time. How can we review the district written goals and assess if they're appropriate or not? Maybe mention that little checkbox. That's where my eye goes first.
Yep. So what I would do first is I would take a look at the goals. I would have the Common Core standards with the connectors and essential understandings printed out next to me, because I just like things physical. And then I would also have the present levels of performance right there with me. And I would kind of cross-reference and see, does this goal align to the chronological grade level that my child is in? Does this goal connect with the standards at that grade level? If we're wanting to make sure that that's an appropriate goal for your child, you look at the present levels of performance. What are they currently able to do? And what is a reasonable goal based on what they're currently doing? What can we reasonably expect them to be able to do in a year from now? And again, it becomes a little subjective and hard to measure and hard to know. And the more teams get to know your child and the way that they learn and the rate and pace at which they learn different skills, then the easier it is to write those goals that are appropriate. But a lot of the expertise around that will also come from you as parents, because you know your child best.
And a quick shout out, if Mitra, I'm sure you saw Lisa posted the Preschool Learning Foundation. She put those in the chat window. Thank you, Lisa. She's one of our IEP specialists at Undivided. Thanks for throwing that in. It's hard to like think back on preschool. Like I would love to go back and look at my daughter's IEP goals. I mean, it was such a, so I feel for you, Mitra. I know those are really overwhelming years. Like it's like, where do I even start? So you're way ahead of most. So also we are getting ready to wrap up. If there's any last questions, put them in the chat. I look back, I did miss one question. I wanted to highlight this. So put any of your last questions into the chat, but Carrie had a question earlier that is really nuts and bolts that goes back to what you were saying about unit planning. And she said, unit-based planning is a great idea. Do you have any examples of that? Would it be a longer term project that might take a little piece of each day's lesson and incorporating it into one modified project that will last for a couple weeks?
Yeah, exactly. So teachers unit plan, so they have a unit on, say, fractions, and then the fraction unit's going to last, 6 weeks, and then they're going to move on to, positive and negative numbers, right? And so that's what I'm talking about and referring to when I'm talking about unit planning. So you'd plan for that entire unit, and it would be different stages of learning those standards for that grade level, right, related to that topic. And yes, and usually there's like a larger project, or there are centers that happen in some classrooms. There are different ways that teachers work towards meeting that overarching goal of the unit. And sometimes the unit is just simply like a different worksheet every day that builds upon each other and builds the skills. But yeah, so we're looking at like, what do we need to do in writing their writing unit? So you think about a persuasive writing unit, then you think about, okay, what's the big picture here? Go from that pre-planning stage to the final 5-paragraph essay stage. And so thinking about units in those contexts, and thinking about what should the goals be, what should the things that my child works on every day to build their skills in this area that's aligned with what the class is doing, what should that look like?
And again, going back to what you said before, Dr. Solone, instead of reactively kind of going in and on the fly trying to modify for every little detail that's happening in the class, which I can also attest to personally for my daughter, becomes, it's not effective, and it becomes extremely overwhelming. And then as they're trying to modify and they're trying to make things happen, like every little detail, the class is moving on, and
right,
it becomes really a cycle of distraction
yes.
and effectiveness.
Right.
So, well, thank you. I don't see any last questions, but feel free to throw anything in there that we can also answer later. I wanted to say always thank you so much, Dr. Solone, for not only talking about what should happen, but really showing us how we need to start breaking it down. And yes, there are bigger issues and huge systemic issues that we all really need to come together to tackle for true equity. But even, when we can start breaking it down in our IEPs and advocating for our child, like you said, then coming together with other families, then hopefully we can really start making these powerhouse differences in schools and districts. And then let's, spread it, because it's only been 40 years since all of the data has come up that this works. And, we're still a little behind. Just a little bit. But I also think we kind of touched on this, but didn't get into it too importantly. But, first we have to visualize, obviously, how this is possible for our kids, what we've been talking about. And then we have to anticipate, or articulate in the IEP who's responsible in all areas of support to make it happen, such as aids, modifications if necessary, any professional development. And then, I just have to say, I can't even remember the first time that I heard you talk about goals in this way, but I do know that that's when my perspective completely changed, as did our advocacy for what Lena needed. So thank you always for sharing your knowledge and your passion for equity with all of us. I also, really, it means so much, because it that little checkbox and like the way the goals, it forced our team to really take her education seriously, and for it to be very clear that what we were shooting for could not be accomplished in her current placement, which was a segregated setting.
Right.
So for us, it was really monumental.
And when we,
yeah, go ahead, please.
When we plan with all kids in mind, then every child thrives in a deeper way in the classroom, right? Because it opens up doors for not just our students who have more significant support needs, but all kids who are struggling with learning or struggling with engagement or struggling to be a part of the classroom community. So it really does open up the doors for everybody in a class when we can really start to plan with the students with the most significant support needs in mind.
Yes, and we actually should probably do a session on really specifically that segment of students as well, because obviously those are the hardest students to include and that get the biggest pushback on the standards-based goals.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you again to Dr. Solone, and all of you have a fabulous weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.